Clarity by Dragon Sin, Chapter 19, Seek Part 2, moments earlier. That had been unexpected, not to mention freaking cool. As Penny launched touchdown, there was nothing more that Ruby wanted to do than rush over there before the dust even had a chance to settle and interrogate her newest friend, which was no longer such a loathsome thing to admit. However, there was another long chat that she undoubtedly had to take care of before that, and then there was the immediate problem standing right in front of her, if possible looking even less enthused than Ruby herself. The disgusted Roman took a drag on his cigar, only to find that it tasted of singed leather, neglected, smoldering away in the web of his gloved hands. Figures, Roman brushed off, along with the long caterpillar of ash which had crawled onto his sleeve, tossing the burnt nub away where it rolled and fell between the cracks of the warped wooden pier. Freaks attack freaks. You're one to talk, Torchwick, Blake growled, the ears folding in anger. Yeah, Sun chimed in, seeing that his fellow faunus was once again trying to take sole responsibility for her kind. I mean, what dude wears eyelashes extensions? They're not lashes fluttered like the plastic glass skirts in a stiff breeze as the crimson's eyes twitched. Ahem. I'm not going to indulge some aped insult that you probably got off some late night talk show, says the wannabe gangster. Besides, in truth, Roman tipped his hat towards Blake with a smile and narrowed eyes that took full advantage of the shade they cast. In deference to the lady, I wasn't talking about you lot. Then his tail flicked as both Sun's and Blake's finer senses picked up something amiss. What? Hey, Sun, look out! However, it was Ruby who reacted faster than she could conjure up the blonde's name, squeezing off a shot which passed by him closer than either would have liked. That said, Sun was unabashedly grateful as the near silent white fang sneaking up on him was forced to withdraw to remove the wedge-shaped blade from his Achilles tendon. They leaped backwards, rolling underneath a swipe from Blake, who would have been seconds too late if not for her captain's timely intervention, though in those intervening seconds they had become surrounded. Didn't we already take these guys out? And if not, the really scary ginger girl who plucked the bullheads from the sky like cherries should prevent reinforcements. But if Sun had any inclination to glance at Penny, he would have found her confronted by no less contingent. They're not the same. With narrow eyes, Blake took in their trappings, white fang uniforms so identical they could have been bought off the shelf that morning, but there was something different about them. The way they carried themselves, speaking of a confidence that was 100% experience and 0% fanatical optimism, not even a grin on their mouths. They might as well have been wearing a full face masks. They're not White Fang. It was a look that, with dreaded experience, Ruby knew all too well. Sure they are. Though he didn't appear as confident as he sounded, Roman patted the one nearest him on the shoulder like testing a hot pan. No one says you actually have to believe in the ideals to join your little club. I'll admit that they're creepy as hell, but when they're on your side, well, I guess you learn to overlook those little things. Careful, guys! Glancing over her shoulder, the huntress and huntsman closed ranks. These aren't White Fang. They're assassins. They won't hesitate to kill. Wait, they're here? Sun questioned in disbelief. What are they doing with the Fang? Ruby took note that he didn't deny their existence. Also, the tone in his voice indicated something. Something she would have to look into later, possibly. I think that's something we'd like to know. With a solemn nod, Blake accepted what she'd do whatever it took. Unlike her misguided kin, these bastards knew exactly what they were getting into. But you don't have to stick around, son. I know you didn't exactly sign up for this. Over his shoulder, he gave Blake a look that was halfway between "Are you kidding?" and "Are you serious?" The one blithely excited as a child confronted with a personally steep hill in a double dog dare, the other desperate to be excused from eating his vegetables. Almost, although what Sun actually did was squat down to avoid the white fang look-alike that was hurled over his head with an unexpected shrill cry. Against their better judgment, the three of them looked to where Penny was dealing with her eighth scratch that her 17th. adversary with an equal number of thick black appendages like tentacles. It's the Kraken! Don't lose focus! Ruby admonished once again, blocking Sun from a strike that would have further stilted the odds against them. The faunus tag-along had the decency to look chagrined, then looked twice over his shoulder and leapfrogged backwards off another disguised assassin who was coming in for a low thrust. He landed with a flourish of his staff, which knocked a pattern of star-shaped blades away from him, took a swing at another assassin who was ready with a block, but not for Sun's staff to break apart in segments and swing around to bash them in the back of the head, though even then they abated the force by rolling forward, coming out of the maneuver with 2 feet up into Sun's gut. The experience Sun had accumulated in the previous fight seemed to count for as little as the daily exercise he needed to keep his stomach as flat as a washboard. These guys were on another level. The cake crushing his rock-hard abs and sending him upwards where another assassin was waiting for him. He managed the substitute with one of his clones, but could not retaliate with more than a glare as his doppelganger was beheaded, the silhouette fading like wisps of incense as he gulped and said a small prayer. Then Sun took Little Red's advice, forgetting that he wasn't supposed to call her that, and got his head back in the game. His chance came from left field as another unfortunate. The ones slated to face Penny could only be described as such at this point, crashed into the two assassins facing him. Not above a low blow himself, Sun landed on them from above with a foot for enough to stomach and bashed their heads with one fell strike. Only when he was sure they were down for the count did he look to see how the girls were faring. Hey, how come you guys get three? Oh, but his answer came even as Sun was beaming the obvious prejudice attention the fairy fighters were getting. Those huntresses could clearly deal with it. Ruby swiftly taking down 2 of her opponents before being stunned by the third, however temporarily. What was less easy to see happened within the time it took to blink, and if he wasn't paying attention, Sun might have missed it. Maybe because he blinked that the snapshot highlighted Ruby like a flash of lightning and he saw something in her fighting. It was there even now as she dueled the last assassin to another standstill, this time in her favor, though it was difficult to tell, rapid blinks blending the two fighters swiftly circling each other into one. That was it. She was fighting them like them. But this treacherous thought seemed to appear at the same time in Ruby, for she balked, stumbled, tripped on footwork that was more instructional than practiced, and for Sun, helping her wasn't something he had to think about. "You all right?" he asked, Ruby admittedly more intimidated by that scythe she used to haul herself off the ground than the murderous enemy who was lying face down with Sun's segment staff wrapped around his ankle. "Yeah." But she was distracted. The instincts she'd been relying upon had usurped her concentration, trying to alert her of something else. "Sorry, son, but can I leave this to you for a second?" "Of course." Giving Ruby a smile she wished was for someone else, Sun removed his cheery expression and turned it on the assassins, who was patiently waiting their tag out. "It'd be pretty embarrassing if I came out to help and didn't pull on my own weight." Ruby might have nodded, but she had ceased paying attention, and in any case, currently had her cheek pressed up against the rest on Crescent Rose, looking down its scythe, a flash of metal striking metal within an adjacent warehouse, like a little bell reminding her that Kitsune was still fighting, and while she certainly had confidence in his skills, it was a good thing she was already holding her breath, because she might have jerked off her aim in surprise. What she saw underneath the reticle would have been unbelievable had she not calibrated and cleaned Crescent Rose optics at least twice a day. Kitsune was being held by his throat by that unknown assassin. An ill-intimidated glow in his other hand illuminated the 2 of them through the hole Kitsune had plowed into the metal wall. He might be annoyed at her interference in his mission, but screw it. Giving as little thought to the cursed word as she did to the decision to pull the trigger, Ruby didn't even stop to feel the recoil and let it turn her back towards her own battle, which was now over. What happened? Where'd they all go? Don't know. Sun said, scratching his head as if he had also just arrived on the scene. Dudes waved hands at one another and threw some smoke bombs. Now, the last wisps of smoke were sinking through the porous decking just as the early morning mists were rolling in from seaward. It would be light soon, and like all night crawlers, the assassins had apparently vanished. But why? Ruby received her answer as the familiar sound of police sirens made themselves known not too far. "We won," Blake asked, and it sounded almost like a real question, with the carcasses of the bullheads still aflame in the background, and half the pier torn up by their intervention. "Fantastic!" A bit of darkness was still left as Penny used arms made of the black goop to swoop them all into a hug that could have crushed graphite to diamond. Though the most uncomfortable part of the whole experience wasn't even knowing that Kitsune had somehow managed to avoid getting swept up in it once again, it was that her other friend, her teammate, was pressed up right next to her. They were forced to look into the other's eyes and acknowledge that once this moment of agony and jubilation was over, there would be a reckoning. So for the first and only time, Ruby didn't bother asking Penny to stop. "I thought I'd find you here." Naruto was himself doing a lot of thinking and hadn't actually heard her approach, though now looking over his shoulder at the huntress holding two ice cream cones, he had yet more to ponder over, such as what self-preacted peril was open in such wee hours, and why the sound of her voice no longer triggered enemy in his mind. "I didn't know what you liked, so I got vanilla." Ruby smiled, oblivious as always, though halfway in handing over the treat, something dire seemed to occur to her, which in turn startled Naruto, who wondered if she too could sense the disturbance. "Wait, have you ever had ice cream?" He didn't respond until he had the object in hand, examining it as an artifact of a previous life. Yes, he finally decided after turning the crisp waffle cone around several times in his hand, looking at the melting sheen as an adult might legs of wine on the glass to determine the vintage of the memory. "I prefer vanilla." "Perfect!" As she gave a relieved cheer and plopped herself down on the edge next to him, not too close though, an arm's length at least between them, which Ruby felt was none the less as awkward as the silence that followed. The incident was over, nothing left to do but twiddle thumbs rather fiercely, bicycle her legs as she tried not to devour her chocolate cone in one nervous gulp. She kept glancing between the sunrise and the sunshine blonde next to her, one almost as slow as the other, so that she thought the ice cream might melt in the morning sun before he got to it, and that would be a true tragedy. The Ruby was disappointed that she didn't get to say goodbye to Penny. The girl had disappeared before the police had arrived, even more mysteriously and competently than the assassins who had left a few White Fang stragglers behind to satisfy the authorities. No one that would actually reveal anything useful, she was sure. She was beginning to understand how the assassins operated, what they were thinking. However, that man, the Vulpine Faunus, mumbled between glacial licks, looking down below at the one victory out of all this, which was ironically a blight on his own team's record, his eyes gazing at the man that had led the police to the docks. "He's the man you tried to kill in town that day," Ruby finished with a small nod and a big lick that she immediately regretted. "Why is he here?" "The day you tried to kill him, he was going to the police station to turn himself in," Ruby explained as she rubbed her forehead, hoping that he didn't take her brain freeze for exasperation. "He's going to testify against the White Fang as well as give them names of important figures." "That's so," the blonde asked, seemingly becoming more engrossed in his eating than the conversation. "I almost killed him before he could," he muttered. Had they been successful in their mission, the vital information the target held would have been wasted. A miscarriage of justice by any stretch. But was this a gross misjudgment on his organization's part? Naruto wasn't foolish. He knew that their system was not infallible. Mistakes were made. Jin had been a prime example of that, but that did get him thinking. What if it wasn't a mistake? A presence of another assassin, regardless if he was one of theirs or not, added a new variable that Naruto had not yet considered. He had always assumed that they were all working towards the same goal, same as the huntsmen and huntresses, however naive their ideals proved to be, and however difficult they went about it. However, no matter how he looked at it, Naruto was finding more in common with the naive girl and her sweet indulgence than the other assassins with his bitter pill. Huh, he hadn't even checked the ice cream for poison, had he? You did, Ruby agreed, unaware of his internal pairings. But you didn't. Having reached this point, she took a few cautious nibbles of her cone, careful not to have the whole thing come flooding out. People, some people can change, and those that can deserve a chance to prove it no matter what they've done in the past. His own life should have been evidence that this was something both Gigi and the girl believed should have been enough. He had no trouble pardoning Tuscan, who had a daughter, a life to live, and more importantly, no blood on his hands. Not directly, anyway. Not like the man down there. Not like him. Yet today proved he could still do some good. That's what he believed. She believed him when he said he had nothing to do with the assassins that allied themselves with the Fang, and maybe that was more important. Then again, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it didn't matter how hard he worked to redeem himself, and though the voice telling him this was softer, it was persistent, not letting him a moment of rest since he had learned to understand what it was saying. Sometimes Ruby began to say, her own ice cream growing soppy in its torch as she searched for the right words in the fading darkness. Sometimes you need to take a leap of faith. Faith? He echoed, knowing that they'd had this conversation just prior, but marveling at the change a little distance seemed to make in it. Mm-hmm. Ruby's eloquent response was accomplished by a dribble of chocolate down her chin as she quickly stuffed the remaining of her cone into her mouth, somehow feeling that this was less embarrassing than repeating herself like a broken record. Hmm. Though if Naruto noticed, and she was positive he did, he either didn't care or chalked it up to her peculiarity. They were different, that was for sure. He knew it had been Ruby who had saved him from the other assassin, and himself. Could he say he would have done the same? Yes, he had, hadn't he? It hadn't only been Gigi he'd been thinking about when fighting against his baser impulses. There had been a time when he had considered unleashing that same dark energy on the girl next to him, but no longer. Things had changed. He could, couldn't he? The unasked question settled into the valley between them, which seemed to fill with the sounds of mundane below. Pen, plainclothes cops compared notes with their ununiformed counterparts, were shooed away by paramedics who were adamantly professional about treating their criminal patients, no different than the three huntresses who had moved past passionate relief at their reunion and were now rehearsing quarrels without any real malice. Red and blue sirens flashed silently, walkie-talkies cracked with blind commands, and without anyone on the other end listening. And in one of the ambulances, a radio had been left on. The song which kept its drivers awake throughout their night shift now drifted out in their open door and carried up to them on the early morning ocean breeze. A quick intermission here. I just want to say the song does play, and I like this song because the song is Clarity by Zed, and it's pretty nice. I recommend you listen to it while I read of what's going on, and it might put into perspective, and you might actually like the scene much better. Oh, I love this song. No longer needing to rely on her own words, Ruby let the song flow through her and breaking wind carry her outstretched arms like wings. The words seemed to grow louder as Ruby began humming along the melody, swaying headlessly and dancing on the lip of the roof, with only faith keeping her from stepping off the edge. She dipped purposely into the air, and for a second Naruto considered reaching out to rescue her. But as the song and her careless routine progressed, Naruto gradually became less worried, more of his action returning to his ice cream, which was by now in far more danger of toppling. In the end, the ice cream was just ice cream, and Ruby was full engrossed in her own indulgence, glancing up at the moon before shaking her head as if the words applied to her. Spreading her arms out as if to gather up all the broken pieces, she slowly brought them back and collapsed them over her heart. Instruments took over for the vocals, and so Ruby hopped down onto the flat part of the roof and let her body be possessed by movement. She was uncoordinated and awkward, So unlike when she was dancing around with that massive scythe. So why was it that Naruto couldn't help but be mesmerized by her? Her prior gesture wept in his hand as it went neglected, his hands now sticky but never feeling so clean. Ruby then stomped her feet twice at the same time as the beat dropped. His heart thumped along with it. The smile on her face was as free as she probably felt in this moment. She began to slow as the music dimmed when it clicked off so abruptly that Naruto was left with the insatiable need to fill the silence the same way as if his lungs were starved for oxygen. Naruto? Ruby blinked away her revere as unaware where his words came from as what it meant. What? My name? He started knowing that like the taking of a life, there was no backing away from this decision. Is Naruto Uzumaki? Ruby blinked, mouthed the name slowly as if trying to be sure that even if this was indeed a dream, she would still remember it when she woke up. Should you tell anyone else this, I will have to eliminate you. Rather than intimidate her, though, this proclamation made Ruby giggle. I'm serious. I know. The awkward indignity just made it more real to her. Ruby strained back over to him with her hands clasped immediately behind her back. My name is Ruby Rose. I am aware. Doesn't count. She pouted, stuck her tongue out before sitting down next to him again, closer this time. Consider this an official greeting. I don't understand the point of this greeting, the fox said, shaking his head and not looking at the girl next to him. I know you don't, she smiled, sighing wistfully and without really thinking about what she was doing, leaning over and resting her head against his shoulder. But Naruto had been expecting it, and so he didn't flinch at the contact. In fact, he didn't make a single movement to stop it. Another intermission. I know there's so many for one episode. I'm sorry. It's just this is the last one, and it's important because Dragon Sen also made an ending, which is also pretty good. Which I also recommend that you put up the song for, which is the ending for Black Clover's fifth ending song, which is pretty good as you know, since you if you've seen Black Clover. And yeah, now back to it. Clarity. A young Naruto walks forwards holding an ice cream in his hand, his expression blank. A young Ruby skips forward while happily munching on a cookie. The two land in front of each other and stare at one another before a storm of rose petals and ash covers the screen. The petals and ash dissipate to reveal an older Ruby and Naruto looking at each other with solemn expressions. It shows the two going about their respective days, such as Naruto interrogating his team and trying to avoid Penny, while Ruby is used as a dream-up doll by Coco and panicking with John about the assignment. Ruby runs forwards, passing her team and classmates. Naruto runs forward, passing by his team and fellow assassins. Ruby stands in front of her mother's grave as she holds the kitsune mask in her hand. Naruto stands in the council room as he looks down at the rose emblem. The mask and emblem appear together before a bright flash occurs. Naruto undoes one of the belts on his arm. Ruby activates Crescent Rose with a single swing. The two tighten their legs and lean forward. Ruby is standing with her hands clasped behind her back, while black flames float in the air around her. In the back, Naruto could be seen facing away from her as a vortex seems to surround him. It shows moments of the two interacting with each other, such as them fighting, doing a kata, and looking at each other. Naruto is standing with his hands in his pockets as rose petals float in the air around him. Ruby can be seen facing away from him as her cloak billows in the wind. A mysterious silver light seems to surround her being. Child Naruto is conversed in shadows and blood as he looks forward, his hair shadowing his eyes. One eye seems to be glowing manically as he holds out his right arm. A young Ruby covers her oversized cloak with a curious look on her face. She stares at her mother's grave, but Summer is standing behind her. Her eyes silver seem to glow. Ruby and Naruto charged at each other and clashed in an explosion of black flames and rose petals. It goes back to them as children looking at each other before walking by without saying anything. It shows teenage Ruby walking away from child Naruto with a small smile and a blush on her face. Teenage Teenage walks away from a child Ruby with no expression but his lips twitching ever so slightly. Clarity appears on the screen. End of chapter 19.